you. And thank you to all of the people who are giving up voluntarily hours of their day to be on Zoom some more. Um, so my name is Kenda Creasy Dean. I teach in practical theology and education at Princeton Theological Seminary. I teach things like youth ministry and spiritual formation and social innovation. And at Princeton Seminary, I mean, I think my take-home phrase from this whole conversation might be "own your ugly." And I'm aware with this conversation that we also sit on land originally owned by the Lenape tribal nations, and our current owning of the ugly at Princeton Seminary has been to come to grips with a slavery audit that was recently completed. So there's a lot of that that has economic impact here at the seminary too, how we deploy resources as a result of all of that. I was thinking this whole conversation, which I'm so grateful for. I've been convinced in the last decade, I guess, that churches and our whole economic model is, in need of an alternative. And it's hard to think about ministry without thinking about social innovation. And so that landed me at SOCAP, which landed me in conversations with the people on this call. But it's kind of a whole meta reflection on Isaiah 55 too. Why do you spend your money on that which is not bread? Why do you labor for those on that doesn't satisfy? And the tension between that and in Deuteronomy, I've set before you life and death, blessing and cursing, therefore choose life so that you and your children may live. And, churches like wealth itself, we've let ourselves believe that there's a lot of things that we spend money on that's bread that's not. In a lot of cases, it's actually toxic. So what happens is we wind up thinking that we're choosing life when it's becoming increasingly obvious that, in fact, the opposite is true. We're investing in sawdust, not in nourishment. And how do we get people to tell the difference, right? We have to somehow allow them to experience what real bread tastes like. And I think that's in some ways what both of your books allow us to get a glimpse of. So both Reggie and I actually come from Methodist backgrounds, and one of the things that you hear about John Wesley saying when you are in a Methodist seminary is, it comes out every year during stewardship campaigns, that Wesley said, earn all that you can, save all that you can, so that you can give all that you can. And that sounds like bread on the surface, and it probably was that in the 18th century. And the story that came to mind when I was thinking about this, you probably read about this a few years back. There was a kid at Princeton University who, he was a philosophy major. He was like the star student of the philosophy department. He had a chance to study philosophy in Oxford after he graduated. He turned it down in order to work at a trading firm on Wall Street. And the reason was, he said, if I can take a high-paying job in finance, I can donate more to charity. And sure enough, he did that. As a 22-year-old, he was giving $100,000 a year to charity. His goal was to give away half of his income in his lifetime. There have been others who have done this. The philosophical name for this is effective altruism. And so it looks like bread, right? It looks like it would be a life-giving path. It looks like it's choosing life. The earning to give movement, it was called, where you deliberately chose a high-paying career to maximize what you could give to charity. But it doesn't translate as naturally as we might think, right? Because it doesn't take into account, for example, who's being abused in order to do the labor that maximizes those earnings, right? What is the ethics or the nature of the business model that underlies finance capital? Is giving money away better than allowing people to do meaningful work that sustains them and honors them? So I appreciate a lot what both of you have done in various ways to present capital as an imagination shifting lever. What if is a central category for both of you. And I have been captivated by the fact that Jed created a musical called What If in order to promote the thesis of his book. And Edgar, your idea of a free imagination is necessary for healing and purpose is a massive way of thinking about that. What if wealth is used to heal and connect and restore? What if stewardship really isn't about money or what it takes for institutional survival, but impact on human flourishing? What if that's how we thought about stewardship campaigns? What if it's more theologically responsible for the church to shift our economic practices and allow people to create their futures instead of getting really good at charity, which may or may not empower people? What if the church had an alternative imagination about money? I appreciated, Mark, you're mentioning that there have been alternative Christian communities throughout history that have done that, like the monasteries. So anyway, we were asked to talk about opportunities and challenges. I'll just list a few that I heard in both of your remarks that were important for me. The opportunities, I kind of zeroed in on the action steps that someone was mentioning in the chat. The action steps that come to mind immediately are, number one, practices of restraint. I was part of a clergy group once where the theme was enough is plenty in order to share resources of inequitable compensation. Practicing restraint is part of what Christian communities have learned to do. I noticed that Jed quoted in his book Martin Luther King saying that our scientific power has outrun our spiritual power, which means just because we can doesn't mean we should. So practices of restraint, like Sabbath, which was mentioned earlier, to stop, take a step back, stop producing. That's not what we're made for. What we're made for is a new way of being. Anyway, the practices of restraint were the first place my imagination went. The second place was the importance of theological reflection in this conversation. Both of you guys were deeply articulate about how the ties to your own personal faith identity have kind of undergirded where you come out in this conversation. And it's that theological reflection that allows us to make this shift in imagination. It's what allows us to own our ugly, because after all, our wholeness doesn't reside in us anyway, it resides in Christ. The third practice was, how do we use money for healing? Edgar, your idea of the money of medicine is so captivating. What happens if Christian communities began to think about bringing together their resources in order to be medicine for others? And then the last opportunity that came to mind was, what happens if Christian communities and not just investors begin organizing their lives, their practices around the metric of ESG, environmental, social governance? We might even add another S for spiritual priorities. But I think that if we became explicit about those things as our metric for value, it would change our practices on a daily basis as well. So those were the opportunities that came to mind. I also, of course, I was feeling really challenged in other ways. And I'll list 5 of the ways that will live with me after this call. One challenge is, what does it mean to live within the framework of abundance rather than scarcity? And what does it mean to try to help people live abundant lives if our neighbor is not experiencing abundance? So I think Christian witnesses would say it's impossible to do that. When one part of the body suffers, we all suffer. So how do we move towards abundance while recognizing and participating in the suffering of our neighbor? The second challenge was the idea that money is not something we do to each other, that what we want to do is kind of liberate people's imaginations. I think Edgar said that. But I've got to say, I've worked with a bunch of churches over the last several years on a number of grants, and churches are terrible at having new imaginations, particularly around money. One of the things I've learned is how badly we are in terms as Christian communities at understanding, using, and accounting for money. Our assumption is somehow we revert to the least spiritual part of our identities when it comes to that topic. And it's particularly obvious when it comes to trying to imagine thinking about money in new ways. The third challenge for me is, what do we do with capitalism? I mean, late consumer finance capitalism in particular, the kind of capitalism that we have right now. What do we do with theologically with the impulse that we want to do well while doing good, which undergirds a lot of social entrepreneurship? I don't think that's really what the movement is about, and I don't hear that in either of your conversations. But I think it's a real question that rank and file Christians have. What do we do with the fact that we live and function within an economic system that has some real liabilities built into it, or at least the way we've experienced it does? The fourth is, how do we get Christian communities to practice detachment? And what I mean by that is to be able to simply hold resources as gifts rather than as possessions. That means we can relinquish it, we can release it. There's a sacrificial part of the Christian story that has to reframe what abundance looked like. Abundance doesn't mean we get to keep a lot more stuff. Abundance means that we don't have to hold it so tightly. And the last thing, I'm really challenged by the idea of moving bulk capital into communities of color. But of course, that presumes that we can also relinquish our need for others to use capital the way we want them to. And how do we begin to risk that? I'll close for now and turn it over to Reggie.